You watch as others manipulate situations to their advantage, while you remain honest and get nowhere. Every day you see colleagues use cunning tactics to advance their careers, while your integrity keeps you invisible. And you're starting to wonder if being good is actually a weakness in this world. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying power, how it's gained, how it's lost, and why the naive always become victims of those who understand its true nature. What I discovered about the mechanics of control will transform how you navigate any situation where power is at play, giving you the awareness to recognize manipulation and the wisdom to protect yourself from those who would use you. The principles I learned in the treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy remain as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. Want to know which corner of the world is ready to break free from control? I was born into a world where power shifted like sand in an hourglass. Florence, in my youth, was a city of merchants and bankers, where golden florins spoke louder than noble blood, and where a family's fortune could vanish overnight if they miscalculated their alliances. My father, Bernardo, was a lawyer of modest means, which meant I grew up close enough to power to observe it, but far enough away to remain invisible to those who wielded it. The Medici family dominated our city when I was young, their banking empire stretching across Europe like an invisible web. I watched Lorenzo, the magnificent hold court, dispensing patronage and punishment with equal grace. He understood something that took me years to fully grasp, that in politics, perception matters more than reality. When he walked through the streets of Florence, people saw a benevolent patron of the arts, a lover of beauty and learning. But I learned to look deeper, to see the iron fist beneath the velvet glove. The Medici seal on documents carried more weight than the Pope's blessing, more authority than any king's decree. That wax impression in red became my first lesson in how power truly operates. It wasn't the beauty of the seal or the noble sentiments it represented, it was the fear and respect that simple mark commanded. When men saw that seal, they knew that behind it stood networks of influence, rivers of gold, and the willingness to use both to destroy anyone who threatened Medici interests. I witnessed the Pazzi conspiracy in 1478, when rival families attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass in the cathedral. The attackers killed Giuliano, but Lorenzo escaped, wounded and bleeding. What followed taught me more about power than any book ever could. Lorenzo didn't simply execute the conspirators, he orchestrated their destruction so completely that their family name became synonymous with treachery for generations. This was my awakening. I realized that those who control others don't simply react to threats, they shape the very landscape in which threats might emerge. They don't wait for enemies to reveal themselves, they create conditions that force potential enemies to show their true nature. The Medici didn't just punish the Pazzi conspiracy, they used it to consolidate their power even further, turning their moment of vulnerability into an opportunity for greater control. I began to understand that what I had taken for political stability was actually a carefully maintained illusion. The peaceful streets, the prosperous merchants, the flowering of art and culture, all of it rested on a foundation of calculated manipulation and strategic intimidation. Those who seemed to hold power effortlessly had simply learned to make their control appear natural and inevitable. In 1498, fortune smiled upon me when I was appointed second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. At 29, I suddenly found myself at the center of power, tasked with handling diplomatic correspondence and military affairs for our city-state. What I discovered in those first months shattered every naive assumption I had held about how governments actually function. My desk became a crossroads where the diplomatic correspondence of Europe converged in encrypted letters between city-states, coded messages from spies, and carefully worded treaties that said one thing while meaning another entirely. Each document was a lesson in the gap between public declarations and private intentions. I learned to read between the lines, to decode the true meaning hidden beneath flowery, diplomatic language. The French would write to us expressing their eternal friendship, while simultaneously negotiating with our enemies. The Spanish would pledge their unwavering support while moving troops toward our borders. Venice would offer mutually beneficial trade agreements while secretly undermining our commerce routes. I realized that in the world of statecraft, words were weapons, and the most dangerous correspondence was often the most beautifully written. I watched our own leaders practice this same deception with masterful skill. In public sessions of the council, they would speak of honor, justice, and the will of the people. But in the private meetings I attended, the conversations were about leverage, weakness, and opportunity. They understood that governing required two completely different skill sets: the ability to inspire public confidence and the willingness to make brutal calculations in private. My education deepened when I began traveling as a diplomatic envoy. I witnessed how skilled negotiators could extract concessions without their counterparts even realizing they were being manipulated. They would create false urgency, manufacture artificial scarcity, and exploit their opponents' assumptions about what they wanted. The most successful diplomats were those who could make their adversaries believe that giving up their advantages was actually in their best interest. I learned that every diplomatic mission was really an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as a negotiation. While openly discussing one set of issues, skilled envoys were secretly probing for information about military strength, financial resources, internal divisions, and leadership weaknesses. The correspondence that resulted from these missions often contained more valuable intelligence than any spy network could provide. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that successful leaders never revealed their true objectives in their correspondence. They would negotiate for positions they didn't actually want, demand concessions they were prepared to abandon, and offer benefits they had no intention of providing. This created multiple layers of deception that protected their real interests, while giving their opponents the illusion of successful negotiation. The diplomatic correspondence taught me that in politics, everything is negotiable except the fundamental drive for power and survival. Treaties exist to be broken when convenient. Alliances shift with changing circumstances. And yesterday's enemy can become today's essential partner. Those who treated diplomatic commitments as sacred promises inevitably found themselves betrayed by more pragmatic opponents. My encounter with Cesare Borgia, Duke of Romagna, fundamentally changed my understanding of what effective leadership actually requires. I met him at the height of his power in 1502, when I was sent as Florence's envoy to his court. What I witnessed there convinced me that most of what people call good leadership is actually a luxury that only the secure can afford. Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, but he had carved out his own domain through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless execution. When I arrived at his court, I expected to meet a typical Renaissance nobleman, cultured, refined, perhaps slightly decadent. Instead, I found a man who had stripped away every pretense and focused entirely on the mechanics of power. Borgia's poisoned ring became legendary among those who knew him intimately. It was an ornate piece of jewelry that appeared purely decorative, but contained a hidden compartment filled with deadly poison. He never had to use its existence was enough. The ring served as a perfect metaphor for his entire approach to leadership, beautiful on the surface, lethal when necessary, and always present as a reminder of what he was capable of. I watched him handle a rebellion in his territories with surgical precision. When several of his subordinate commanders plotted against him, he didn't simply crush them with force. Instead, he invited them to a reconciliation meeting, embraced them as returning friends, and then had them quietly eliminated that same evening. The brilliance lay not in the violence itself, but in how he used it to send a message to every other potential rebel, while maintaining the appearance of mercy and forgiveness. What impressed me most was Borgia's understanding that cruelty and kindness were simply tools to be used as circumstances demanded. He could be genuinely generous to those who served him faithfully, but he never let sentiment cloud his judgment about what needed to be done. When the situation required harshness, he applied it swiftly and completely, then returned to his normal demeanor as if nothing had happened. Borgia taught me that effective leaders must be willing to bear the moral burden of necessary actions that others cannot or will not take. While his subjects enjoyed peace and prosperity in their daily lives, Borgia carried the weight of making decisions that ensured that peace would continue. He understood that leadership often means protecting people from consequences they cannot foresee and threats they cannot comprehend. I realized that most people want to believe in leaders who share their moral limitations, who would never do anything they themselves would not do. But this creates a fatal weakness. When you face opponents who have no such limitations, your moral constraints become their advantages. Borgia had eliminated this disadvantage by accepting that leadership sometimes requires actions that followers could never stomach. The Duke showed me that power is ultimately about results, not methods. His territories were well governed, his people were prosperous, and his enemies were contained. Whether he achieved these outcomes through diplomacy or intimidation mattered less than the fact that he achieved them at all. This pragmatic focus on effectiveness over appearance became a cornerstone of my political philosophy. Watching Borgia operate convinced me that the most dangerous leaders are those who have learned to separate their personal morality from their public responsibilities. They can sleep peacefully at night because they understand that the alternative to their harsh decisions is often chaos and suffering for thousands of innocent people. During my years observing political theater, I developed what became my most famous metaphor, that a prince must learn to fight like both a lion and a fox. The dual-faced mask I kept in my study served as a constant reminder of this principle. On one side, the fierce visage of a lion represented raw strength and intimidation. On the other, the cunning expression of a fox symbolized intelligence and adaptability. Effective leadership requires mastering both natures. I learned this lesson through painful observation of leaders who relied too heavily on only one approach, those who acted only as lions, who believed that force and intimidation were always sufficient, eventually encountered problems that could not be solved through strength alone. They found themselves outmaneuvered by more clever opponents who had studied their patterns and learned to work around their limitations. Conversely, leaders who acted only as foxes, who believed that cleverness and manipulation were always superior to direct action, eventually faced situations that required immediate, decisive force. When their bluffs were called and their schemes were exposed, they had no recourse except retreat or submission. Their enemies learned to ignore their threats because they knew the fox would never actually bite. The key insight is knowing which approach the situation demands. When facing opponents who respect only strength, you must be the lion. When confronting those who mistake kindness for weakness, you must demonstrate your capacity for ferocity. But when dealing with complex problems that cannot be solved through force alone, you must become the fox, patient, observant, and willing to achieve your objectives through indirect means. I witnessed this principle in action during territorial disputes between city-states. The successful leaders were those who could negotiate complex treaties while maintaining credible military threats. They would smile and speak softly during diplomatic meetings, but their armies would be positioned where everyone could see them. The combination of visible strength and demonstrated reasonableness gave them enormous leverage in negotiations. The fox nature becomes essential when dealing with opponents who are stronger than you. Direct confrontation would be suicidal. but careful maneuvering can neutralize their advantages. I saw smaller city-states survive and even prosper by forming strategic alliances, exploiting the internal divisions of their enemies, and timing their actions to coincide with their opponents' moments of weakness. However, the lion nature remains crucial for establishing credibility and deterring challenges. Opponents must believe that you are capable of and willing to use force when necessary. This doesn't mean being aggressive or violent. It means ensuring that potential enemies understand the costs of opposing you. Sometimes a demonstration of strength prevents the need for actual conflict. The most sophisticated practitioners of this dual nature learned to switch between approaches seamlessly within the same interaction. They could begin a conversation with veiled threats, transition to reasonable negotiation, and conclude with generous offers, all while maintaining perfect composure. Their opponents never knew which version they were dealing with, which created constant uncertainty and prevented effective counter-strategies. I discovered that this duality extends beyond politics into every aspect of human interaction. In business, you must be fierce enough to compete effectively, but clever enough to find opportunities that others miss. In relationships, you must be strong enough to command respect, but wise enough to know when compromise serves your interests better than confrontation. The mask reminds me that authenticity, while admirable in personal relationships, can be a fatal weakness in competitive environments. Those who insist on always showing their true nature give their opponents complete information about how to manipulate them. The ability to present different aspects of your character as circumstances require is not deception, it is adaptation. The gilded dagger I keep as a reminder of this principle appears to be a purely ceremonial weapon, beautiful, ornate, seemingly designed only for display. Yet beneath its decorative exterior lies a razor-sharp blade capable of lethal precision. This dagger embodies one of the most crucial lessons I learned about power: the necessity of appearing virtuous while maintaining the capability for decisive action when virtue alone proves insufficient. I discovered this truth through watching leaders who confused moral purity with political effectiveness. They believed that their good intentions would be enough to achieve good outcomes, but they found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by opponents who had no such constraints. Their commitment to always taking the moral high ground became a predictable weakness that others exploited ruthlessly. The most successful leaders, I observed, understood that public virtue and private pragmatism were not contradictory but complementary. They cultivated reputations for fairness, generosity, and integrity because these qualities inspired loyalty and trust. But they also maintained the capacity for harshness, deception, and self-interest when circumstances demanded such responses. Their public image gave them credibility, while their private capabilities gave them effectiveness. This principle extends far beyond politics into every competitive environment. In business, successful leaders project images of ethical behavior and concern for stakeholders, but they remain willing to make tough decisions that may harm some interests in service of larger objectives. They understand that maintaining their virtuous reputation actually increases their ability to act decisively when necessary, because people expect good intentions behind their actions. I learned that appearing virtuous is often more valuable than being virtuous, because appearance shapes how others respond to your actions. When people believe you are fundamentally good, they interpret your harsh decisions as regrettable necessities rather than expressions of cruelty or ambition. This gives you tremendous freedom to do what needs to be done without triggering the resistance that would greet the same actions from someone with a different reputation. The key insight is that virtue must be strategic rather than absolute. Blind adherence to moral principles without regard for consequences often produces worse outcomes than carefully calculated compromises. The leader who refuses to lie to an enemy may inadvertently cause the deaths of thousands of innocent people. The business executive who refuses to engage in competitive intelligence may allow competitors to destroy jobs and communities. However, this does not mean abandoning all moral considerations. Rather, it means recognizing that the highest moral responsibility of leadership is achieving positive outcomes for those you serve. Sometimes this requires taking actions that would be immoral for private individuals but become necessary for those who bear responsibility for others' welfare. I observed that the most dangerous opponents were those who had learned to weaponize virtue itself. They would position themselves as moral authorities and use this reputation to attack their enemies' credibility. They understood that accusations of impropriety could destroy a leader more effectively than military force or economic pressure. Defending against such attacks requires maintaining an impeccable public image, while quietly neutralizing the sources of accusation. The gilded dagger teaches us that strength hidden behind beauty is often more powerful than strength displayed openly. When people underestimate your capabilities because they focus on your virtuous appearance, you gain enormous strategic advantages. They approach you without adequate defenses, share information they should protect, and fail to prepare for the decisive actions you might take. This principle requires careful balance. If your virtuous facade is too obvious, people will see through it and view you as hypocritical. If your capabilities are too hidden, people may doubt your ability to follow through on commitments. The art lies in projecting genuine virtue in your daily interactions while ensuring that those who might oppose you understand the consequences of pushing you too far. The iron glove wrapped in velvet that sits upon my desk represents one of the most misunderstood aspects of my political philosophy, the relationship between fear and love in leadership. Most people assume these are opposite forces, but I learned they are complementary tools that must be balanced carefully. The glove's hard metal provides protection and strength, while the soft fabric creates the appearance of gentleness. Effective leadership requires both elements. When I wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, I was not advocating for cruelty or tyranny. I was observing a fundamental truth about human nature. Love is voluntary and unpredictable, while fear is reliable and controllable. People can withdraw their affection on a whim, influenced by rumors, personal disappointments, or simply changing moods. But fear, properly applied, creates consistent behavioral responses, regardless of emotional fluctuations. I witnessed this principle during the rule of Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, who inherited tremendous goodwill and affection from the Florentine people. Yet when French armies approached the city and difficult decisions needed to be made, that love evaporated instantly. The same citizens who had cheered him in good times turned against him when circumstances became challenging. His reliance on their affection left him with no foundation when their emotions shifted. Compare this to the rule of Cesare Borgia, who was never beloved by his subjects, but was deeply respected and feared. When crises arose in his territories, people continued to obey his commands and support his policies, not because they felt affection for him, but because they understood the consequences of opposition. This gave him stability and predictability that leaders dependent on love could never achieve. However, I must emphasize that the fear I advocate is not the terror of a madman, but the respectful apprehension that comes from understanding someone's capabilities and willingness to use them. The goal is not to make people hate you, but to ensure they understand that opposing you carries real costs. This type of fear can coexist with genuine respect, and even a form of admiration. The iron glove teaches us that strength must be present but need not be constantly displayed. People should know you possess the capability for decisive action, but they should not live in constant anxiety about when you might use it. The velvet covering represents the courtesy, fairness, and consideration that should characterize your normal interactions. Most of the time, people should experience the soft exterior, but they must never forget what lies beneath. I learned that the most effective leaders inspire what I call protective fear, the understanding that challenging them would be costly, combined with the belief that supporting them provides safety and opportunity. This creates loyalty based not on emotional attachment, but on rational calculation of interests. Such loyalty proves far more durable than relationships based purely on affection. The balance between fear and love becomes crucial during times of crisis. When resources are scarce, difficult decisions must be made, and some people must be disappointed. Leaders who have relied entirely on love find themselves abandoned by those who no longer benefit from their policies. Leaders who have cultivated appropriate fear retain the ability to implement necessary but unpopular measures. This principle applies beyond politics to any situation where you must influence others' behavior over time. In business, employees may like a manager personally, but if that manager lacks credibility about consequences, the employees will gradually test boundaries and ignore directives. The manager who combines fairness with clear expectations and consistent follow-through maintains better long-term relationships and achieves superior results. The velvet covering remains essential because naked intimidation breeds resentment and eventually rebellion. People must believe that your use of power serves legitimate purposes and follows understandable principles. They should fear your displeasure but not feel that you are arbitrary or malicious in applying consequences. I discovered that the ideal situation combines respectful fear with earned gratitude. People understand your power but appreciate how you choose to exercise it. This creates the strongest possible foundation for sustained influence, because it appeals to both emotional and rational motivations, while protecting against the volatility that destroys relationships based on either pure affection or pure intimidation. The chess set of shadows that dominates my study serves as a perfect metaphor for strategic thinking. Peace appears to be one thing, while casting the shadow of something entirely different. This represents how effective strategy requires seeing beyond obvious moves to understand the deeper patterns that determine outcomes. Those who focus only on immediate, visible actions inevitably fall victim to opponents who think several levels deeper. I learned the art of strategic deception not from books, but from watching master practitioners who could manipulate entire situations while appearing to be passive participants. They understood that the most powerful deceptions are not outright lies, but careful presentations of partial truths that lead others to draw incorrect conclusions. This approach proves more effective than direct falsehood because it allows people to convince themselves, which creates much stronger belief than simple manipulation. During diplomatic negotiations, I observed how skilled practitioners would spend days discussing issues they cared nothing about, while subtly gathering intelligence about the topics that actually mattered to them. Their opponents would focus on winning the visible debates, never realizing that they were revealing crucial information about their real priorities, capabilities, and weaknesses. By the time the substantive negotiations began, the master diplomats had already gained decisive advantages. The key principle is that strategic deception serves defensive as much as offensive purposes. When your enemies cannot accurately assess your intentions, capabilities, or timeline, they cannot develop effective countermeasures. They must prepare for multiple possible scenarios, which disperses their resources and attention. Meanwhile, you can focus your efforts precisely because you understand your own objectives clearly. I discovered that the most elegant deceptions involve allowing your opponents to deceive themselves, rather than forcing them to believe something false. You create situations where their own assumptions, biases, and desires lead them toward incorrect interpretations. This approach proves nearly impossible to defend against, because the victims participate actively in their own misdirection. Strategic deception also requires understanding how your enemies gather and process information. If you know they rely heavily on certain sources, you can influence what those sources report. If you understand their analytical frameworks, you can present information in ways that fit their expectations while serving your purposes. The chess set reminds me that controlling the information environment is often more valuable than controlling physical resources. However, strategic deception demands careful attention to consistency and plausibility. If your deceptions contradict each other or require people to believe obviously false things, they will be exposed and your credibility will be destroyed. The most effective approach involves building layers of truth that support a false conclusion, rather than constructing elaborate fantasies that collapse under scrutiny. I learned that timing plays a crucial role in strategic deception. Information revealed too early allows enemies time to verify and respond. Information revealed too late lacks credibility and impact. The art lies in understanding when your opponents are most receptive to the conclusions you want them to draw, and presenting evidence at those moments of maximum influence. The shadows cast by the chess pieces teach us that every action has both visible and hidden consequences. While your opponents focus on countering your apparent moves, your real strategy unfolds in areas they are not watching. This principle applies to any competitive situation where multiple parties are trying to anticipate and counter each other's actions. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that strategic deception must serve genuine strategic purposes. Deception for its own sake creates unnecessary complications and risks, but when used to protect vital interests, gain crucial advantages, or prevent greater conflicts, it becomes an essential tool of leadership. The master practitioner uses deception sparingly and precisely, always in service of larger objectives that justify the moral complexity of misleading others. The chess set reminds me daily that in any serious competition, your opponents are trying to deceive you just as you were trying to deceive them. Understanding this reality allows you to protect yourself while developing your own capabilities for strategic misdirection when circumstances require such measures. The three-sided coin that sits impossible in my collection represents one of my most crucial insights about human nature in political environments: that most people are neither true allies nor committed enemies, but calculating opportunists who will shift their allegiances based on changing circumstances. This impossible artifact serves as a constant reminder that binary thinking about relationships creates dangerous blind spots. I learnt this lesson through painful experience with those I had initially trusted as reliable allies. During the various crises that befell Florence, I watched supposed friends abandon us the moment our position weakened, while some former enemies offered assistance when it served their interests. The patterns taught me that loyalty based purely on personal affection or historical alliance proves far less reliable than loyalty based on mutual benefit and shared interests. The most dangerous category proves to be the neutral, those who claim to avoid taking sides while carefully positioning themselves to benefit regardless of outcomes. During the wars between France and Spain for control of Italian territories, I observed how supposedly neutral city-states would secretly negotiate with both sides, promise support to whoever seemed likely to win, and then claim they had been forced into their eventual choice by circumstances beyond their control. These neutral parties often prove more threatening than open enemies, because they cannot be anticipated or countered directly. An enemy's hostility is visible and can be prepared for, but a neutral party's eventual betrayal comes as a surprise that disrupts carefully laid plans. Worse, their claims of forced neutrality make it difficult to punish them afterward without appearing unreasonable. I developed the principle that neutrality itself is a form of opposition because it denies you the support you need while giving your enemies the same advantages. When conflicts arise, those who refuse to choose sides are essentially choosing the side of whoever proves stronger. This makes them unreliable partners for any long-term strategy that requires sustained commitment through difficult periods. The three faces of the coin represent the different masks people wear when dealing with power. To your face, they may appear supportive and friendly. To your enemies, they may appear sympathetic and helpful. To themselves, they may appear prudent and pragmatic. But underneath all these appearances lies a fundamental opportunism that makes them untrustworthy allies and unpredictable enemies. I learned to identify the signs of true commitment versus convenient alliance. Real allies will sacrifice something valuable to support you even when the outcome remains uncertain. Opportunistic allies will support you only when doing so costs them nothing and benefits them directly. The difference becomes clear during moments of crisis, when the costs of loyalty increase and the benefits become uncertain. However, I also discovered that opportunistic allies can be valuable if you understand their nature and work with it rather than against it. Instead of expecting loyalty based on principle, you can create situations where supporting you consistently serves their interests better than any alternative. This requires ongoing effort to maintain their incentives, but it can produce more reliable results than appeals to friendship or honor. The art lies in distinguishing between those who can be converted into genuine allies through shared interests and experiences, and those who will always remain fundamentally. Some people develop loyalty through successful collaboration and mutual support over time. Others will betray any relationship when a better opportunity arises. Regardless of history or personal connection, I learned to build multiple layers of alliance and support rather than depending on any single relationship or faction. This approach assumes that some allies will inevitably prove unreliable, so you must have alternatives ready when defections occur. The strongest position combines a core of truly committed supporters with a broader network of conditional allies, whose interests align with yours in specific situations. The impossible coin reminds me that in politics, permanent enemies and permanent friends are both rare. Most relationships exist in a fluid middle ground where today's opponent may become tomorrow's ally, and today's supporter may become tomorrow's threat. Understanding this reality allows you to work effectively with the complex, shifting loyalties that characterize any competitive environment where multiple parties are pursuing their own interests. The shattered pedestal in my study once supported a marble statue of justice blindfolded, holding scales and sword, representing the ideal of impartial moral authority. The statue fell during an earthquake, but I kept the broken pedestal as a reminder of what happens to those who place themselves above the pragmatic realities of power. Moral idealism, while admirable in theory, becomes a fatal weakness when it prevents leaders from making necessary compromises with imperfect circumstances. I witnessed this tragedy repeatedly during my years in government. Leaders who insisted on absolute moral purity found themselves unable to function effectively in a world where every choice involves trade-offs between competing values. They would spend crucial time debating the ethical implications of decisions, while their enemies acted decisively to gain advantages. Their commitment to perfect solutions prevented them from achieving good solutions. The most dangerous aspect of rigid moral idealism is how it makes leaders predictable to their opponents. When everyone knows you will never lie, manipulate, or use force regardless of circumstances, they can design strategies that exploit these limitations. Your enemies can position themselves behind innocent shields, knowing you will not act against them. They can spread misinformation about you, knowing you will not respond with effective counter-propaganda. I observed how moral idealists often become unwitting accomplices to the very evils they claim to oppose. Their refusal to engage in strategic deception allows genuinely corrupt opponents to present themselves as equally virtuous. Their insistence on playing by rules that their enemies ignore gives those enemies systematic advantages. Their commitment to transparency reveals information that helps hostile forces while providing no reciprocal benefits. The shattered pedestal represents the inevitable collapse that occurs when leaders try to govern from a position of assumed moral superiority. They create expectations they cannot possibly meet because real leadership requires making choices between competing goods, not between good and evil. When their inevitable compromises are revealed, they lose credibility more completely than leaders who never claimed moral perfection. However, I do not advocate for abandoning moral considerations entirely. Rather, I argue for a more sophisticated understanding of moral responsibility that recognizes the difference between personal virtue and leadership ethics. Personal virtue focuses on keeping your own hands clean. Leadership ethics focuses on achieving the best possible outcomes for those you serve, even when this requires taking morally ambiguous actions. The highest moral responsibility of leadership is preventing greater evils through lesser compromises. A leader who refuses to deceive an enemy may inadvertently cause the deaths of innocent people. A leader who refuses to use strategic intimidation may allow aggressive opponents to destroy peaceful communities. In such cases, moral purity becomes moral abdication of responsibility. I learned to distinguish between core principles that should never be violated and tactical preferences that can be adjusted based on circumstances. Core principles might include protecting innocent life and maintaining ultimate accountability for your actions. Tactical preferences might include transparency, collaboration, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. The wise leader holds firmly to principles while remaining flexible about methods. The broken pedestal also reminds me that moral authority must be earned through effective results, not claimed through theoretical positions. Leaders who consistently achieve positive outcomes while maintaining essential ethical standards gain more moral credibility than those who maintain perfect theoretical consistency while failing to protect those they serve. I discovered that the most effective moral framework for leadership is consequentialist rather than absolutist. Instead of asking whether specific actions conform to ideal standards, the key question becomes whether the overall pattern of your decisions produces better outcomes than available alternatives. This approach allows for tactical compromises while maintaining strategic moral coherence. The tragedy of moral idealism is that it often serves the psychological needs of the leader more than the practical needs of the LED. Leaders can feel virtuous about their pure intentions while their organizations, communities, or nations suffer from their inability to navigate complex realities. True moral courage sometimes requires accepting personal moral ambiguity in service of larger responsibilities. The pedestal's fragments remind me daily that sustainable moral authority comes from demonstrating wisdom and effectiveness over time, not from claiming theoretical perfection. Those who understand this paradox can maintain their essential integrity while developing the practical capabilities that leadership requires. The network of golden threads that spans one wall of my study represents perhaps the most underestimated source of power in any competitive environment: information asymmetry. Each thread connects different points representing people, institutions, and events, showing how knowledge flows through complex networks. Those who control these information flows possess advantages that often prove more valuable than military force or economic resources. I learned this principle during my diplomatic missions when I discovered that the most successful negotiations were won before they began, through superior intelligence about the other party's true positions, constraints, and alternatives. While my counterparts focused on developing persuasive arguments for the formal sessions, I spent my time understanding their internal politics, financial pressures, and personal motivations. This preparation allowed me to structure proposals that appeared generous while actually serving our interests. Information becomes power through creating asymmetric understanding of situations. When you know something your opponents do not, you can act on that knowledge while they remain reactive to developments they cannot predict. When you understand their constraints while they misunderstand yours, you can design strategies that appear risky to them while actually being quite safe for you. The golden threads teach us that information rarely travels directly between important parties. Instead, it flows through networks of intermediaries, each of whom may add, subtract, or distort the original message. Understanding these networks allows you to influence what information reaches your opponents and how they interpret it. You can also identify the key nodes whose cooperation or corruption gives you access to crucial intelligence. I discovered that people reveal far more than they realize through their patterns of behavior, resource allocation, and timing of actions. A diplomatic mission's size and composition reveals how seriously they take the negotiations. The speed of their responses indicates their eagerness or reluctance. The officials they choose to include or exclude provides insights into their internal power structures and decision-making processes. The art of gathering intelligence without appearing to do so becomes essential for maintaining relationships while gaining advantages. Direct questioning often triggers defensive responses that reduce the quality of information you receive. But casual conversations, careful observation, and strategic social interactions can provide tremendous insights while appearing to be ordinary. Relationship-building activities. I learned to distinguish between information that changes frequently and knowledge that remains relatively stable. Understanding someone's fundamental motivations, values, and constraints provides lasting advantages that survive tactical shifts in their positions. But knowing their immediate plans or current resources helps primarily with short-term maneuvering. The most valuable intelligence combines both types of understanding, creating information. Asymmetry requires controlling not just what you know, but what others know about you, revealing accurate but incomplete information about your situation can lead opponents to make incorrect assumptions about your capabilities and intentions. Demonstrating knowledge about some of their secrets while concealing the full extent of your intelligence. Network keeps them uncertain about what you might know. The threads also represent how information can be weaponized through strategic disclosure, revealing embarrassing or damaging information about opponents at carefully chosen moments can neutralize their advantages or force them into reactive positions. But this weapon must be used sparingly and precisely, because excessive use makes you appear untrustworthy and encourages others to develop better security. I observed that in any organization or competitive environment, informal information networks often matter more than formal communication channels. Understanding who talks to whom, who trusts whom, and who influences whom provides a map of how decisions actually get made and how influence actually flows. These networks often differ dramatically from official organizational charts. The golden network reminds me that information's value depends not just on its accuracy, but on its exclusivity and timing. Information that everyone possesses provides no advantages. Information that arrives too late to influence decisions proves worthless, regardless of its quality. The art lies in developing sources that provide unique insights at moments when you can act on them effectively. The hourglass of opportunity that sits upon my desk defies natural Lutzand flows upward instead of down, symbolizing how those who truly understand timing can reverse seemingly inevitable outcomes. This impossible timepiece reminds me daily that in politics, as in war, timing often matters more than strength, resources, or even strategy. The same action that proves disastrous when taken too early or too late can achieve miraculous results when executed at precisely the right moment. I learned this lesson during the crisis of 1512, when Spanish forces threatened Florence and our government faced impossible choices. Many counselors urged immediate action, either complete submission or desperate resistance. Others advocated indefinite delay, hoping circumstances would somehow improve. I realized that both approaches ignored the fundamental question: when would action be most effective, regardless of our preferences about timing? The upward flowing sand represents how proper timing can reverse apparent disadvantages. When Spanish armies first appeared threatening, we seemed to be in a hopeless position. But by carefully observing their supply situation, internal politics, and competing obligations, we identified moments when their apparent strength was actually vulnerable to well-timed pressure. Acting during these windows of opportunity allowed us to achieve outcomes that would have been impossible during periods of their maximum strength. I discovered that timing creates its own form of leverage that can multiply the effectiveness of limited resources. A small force arriving at exactly the right moment can achieve what a large force cannot accomplish through poorly timed action. A modest diplomatic initiative launched when opponents are distracted or divided can succeed where major efforts fail during periods of their unity and focus. The art of timing requires understanding the rhythms and cycles that govern human behavior and institutional decision-making. People have periods of high energy and attention, followed by periods of fatigue and distraction. Organizations have seasons of internal focus, followed by external engagement. Markets have cycles of expansion and contraction. Those who learn to read these patterns can position their actions to coincide with favorable phases. However, perfect timing often conflicts with perfect preparation. Waiting until you have ideal resources and complete information usually means missing the optimal moment for action. The hourglass teaches us that opportunity itself is a resource that must be weighed against other considerations. Sometimes acting with adequate preparation during the right moment produces better results than acting with perfect preparation at the wrong time. I observed that timing affects not just the success of individual actions, but how those actions are interpreted and remembered. The same decision that appears brilliant when it succeeds can seem reckless when circumstances change. Leaders must consider not only immediate tactical outcomes, but how their timing will be understood by allies, enemies, and future observers, who may judge them based on incomplete information. The upward flow of sand also represents how skillful timing can create momentum that carries you beyond what your initial action could achieve alone. When you act at moments when social, political, or economic forces are ready to move in your direction, your intervention can trigger much larger changes. Understanding these leverage points allows modest actions to produce disproportionate results. I learned to distinguish between timing you can control and timing you must accept. You cannot usually control when crises will emerge or when opportunities will appear, but you can control how quickly you recognize and respond to these developments. Maintaining the flexibility to act rapidly when favorable moments arise often matters more than trying to create perfect timing through advanced planning. The hourglass reminds me that timing is often more about recognition than calculation. The moment for action frequently presents itself suddenly, without advance warning. Leaders who spend too much time analyzing whether conditions are optimal often miss the brief windows when decisive action becomes possible. The ability to recognize and seize these moments requires intuitive understanding developed through experience rather than purely analytical thinking. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that good timing requires accepting uncertainty about outcomes. You must act based on incomplete information about how circumstances will develop. This creates anxiety for leaders who prefer predictability, but it also creates opportunities for those willing to make calculated risks. When the potential benefits justify the uncertainty involved, the chameleon skin that drapes across my study chair changes color and texture based on its surroundings, representing one of the most essential but overlooked skills for surviving in competitive environments. The ability to adapt your approach to match changing circumstances. Most people develop strategies that work in specific situations, then continue using those same strategies even when conditions change dramatically. This inflexibility destroys more careers and organizations than any external enemy ever could. I witnessed this principle during the transition from the Florentine Republic to Medici rule and back again. Officials who had thrived under one system found themselves completely ineffective under another, not because they lacked ability, but because they could not adjust their methods to new realities. They continued using approaches that had brought them success, never recognizing that their environment had fundamentally changed. The chameleon's skin teaches us that adaptation requires more than surface adjustments. It demands fundamental changes in how you present yourself and operate. When power structures shift, you cannot simply modify your tactics while maintaining the same basic approach. You must develop entirely new capabilities that match the new environment's requirements and opportunities. I learned that successful adaptation begins with recognizing what has changed and what remains constant. During political transitions, the formal structures of power may change completely, while the informal networks that actually control resources remain largely intact. Understanding these distinctions allows you to adjust your approach appropriately, rather than wasting effort on changes that matter less than they appear to. The most dangerous period for any individual or organization comes during transitions when old approaches no longer work but new approaches have not yet been developed. During these vulnerable periods, those who adapt quickly gain enormous advantages over those who cling to familiar but obsolete strategies. The chameleon survives because it changes preemptively rather than waiting until change becomes unavoidable. However, adaptation cannot be purely reactive if you want to maintain any control over your destiny. The most successful practitioners learn to anticipate environmental changes and begin developing new capabilities before they become essential. This requires constant attention to early warning signals that indicate shifts in power, technology, or social dynamics that could affect your position. I discovered that adaptation often requires temporary acceptance of reduced status or influence while you develop new capabilities. Pride and ego can prevent necessary adjustments because they make people unwilling to appear incompetent or subordinate during learning periods. But temporary setbacks during adaptation phases often position you for much greater long-term success than stubborn maintenance of approaches that are becoming obsolete. The changing texture of the chameleon's skin represents how adaptation must go beyond superficial modifications to include fundamental changes in how you operate. This might mean developing new skills, building different types of relationships, or even altering your basic approach to problem solving. Surface changes that leave your core methods unchanged rarely provide adequate protection during significant environmental shifts. I observed that the most adaptable individuals and organizations maintain multiple capabilities simultaneously rather than specializing exclusively in approaches suited to current conditions. This diversity creates resilience because changes that threaten one capability may actually benefit others. The investment in maintaining unused capabilities pays dividends when environmental changes suddenly make them valuable. Adaptation also requires understanding not just what you must change, but what you must preserve. Core principles, essential relationships, and fundamental capabilities that transcend specific circumstances should be maintained, even during periods of dramatic adjustment. The art lies in distinguishing between elements that must change and elements that must remain constant. The chameleon's skin reminds me that adaptation is an ongoing process rather than a one-time adjustment. Successful survival requires continuous monitoring of environmental changes and constant refinement of your approaches. Those who adapt once and then assume they have solved the problem permanently, find themselves vulnerable to the next wave of changes. Perhaps, most importantly, I learned that adaptation requires accepting uncertainty about future conditions. You cannot predict exactly what capabilities will be needed or what strategies will prove effective. This means developing general adaptability, the ability to learn quickly and adjust effectively rather than trying to prepare specifically for every possible scenario. The burden stone that sits beside my writing desk appears deceptively simpler, smooth, dark stone that seems to weigh nothing when first lifted. But the longer you carry it, the heavier it becomes, until eventually its weight becomes almost unbearable. This impossible artifact represents the psychological cost of truly understanding how power operates in human society. Once you see the mechanisms of control and manipulation clearly, you can never return to the comfortable ignorance that shields most people from these harsh realities. I remember the precise moment when my innocence died. It was during my first major diplomatic assignment, when I realized that the respected leader I was negotiating with had built his entire reputation on carefully constructed lies. His public image of virtue and wisdom was completely false. Yet everyone around him, including his closest advisors, either believed the illusion or participated in maintaining it. The shock was not just that he was corrupt, but that the entire system depended on this corruption being hidden from those it affected. This awareness changed everything about how I viewed human relationships and social institutions. Conversations that once seemed straightforward revealed themselves as complex negotiations, where everyone was pursuing hidden agendas. Acts of apparent generosity and kindness became suspect. I found myself constantly analyzing whether good deeds were genuine or calculated moves in larger strategies. The world became a much more complicated and morally ambiguous place. The burden stone grows heavier because knowledge of power dynamics isolates you from those who remain naive about these realities. You cannot share your insights without appearing cynical or paranoid. You cannot participate innocently in social rituals that you now understand serve political purposes. You become an outsider, observing a performance that everyone else believes is real life. This isolation extends to romantic relationships, friendships, and family connections. When you understand how people use emotional manipulation to control others, you become hyper-aware of these techniques in your personal life. You start questioning whether expressions of love and loyalty are genuine or strategic. This suspicion damages relationships even when your partners are completely sincere, because your awareness makes authentic interaction more difficult. I discovered that knowledge of power creates moral burdens that ignorance avoids. When you understand how systems of oppression and exploitation function, you become complicit if you benefit from them without resistance. But resistance often requires sacrificing your own security and comfort. The comfortable position of passive ignorance becomes impossible once you clearly see what your society's prosperity costs other people. The weight increases because understanding power reveals how little control you actually have over your own life. You realize that most of your important opportunities and constraints result from decisions made by people you will never meet, pursuing objectives you cannot influence. This knowledge can lead to despair or paranoia if you cannot find ways to maintain some sense of agency and purpose. However, the burden also brings certain compensations. Understanding power dynamics makes you much more effective at protecting yourself and those you care about. You can recognize manipulation attempts before they succeed. You can avoid many of the traps that destroy people who never understand what happened to them. You can sometimes find ways to work within systems to achieve positive outcomes that would be impossible through naive approaches. The stone teaches me that awareness itself becomes a form of responsibility. Once you understand how things really work, you must decide how to use that knowledge. Will you exploit it for personal advantage? Will you try to educate others despite the costs? Will you work to change systems while accepting that most changes will be incremental and partial? There are no easy answers, but ignorance is no longer an option. I learned to manage the burden through accepting the limitations of what any individual can accomplish while maintaining commitment to doing what little good remains possible. Perfect justice and complete honesty may be impossible in human society, but incremental improvements and moments of genuine integrity still matter. The goal becomes finding ways to work constructively within imperfect systems, rather than being paralyzed by their imperfections. The burden stone reminds me daily that knowledge of power is both a privilege and a curse. It provides capabilities that can protect and serve others, but it also creates isolation and moral complexity that comfortable ignorance avoids. Carrying this weight is the price of seeing clearly, and once you have paid it, there is no way to return to the simpler world that existed before your eyes were opened. The digital panopticon that sits upon my modern desk appears to be an ordinary smartphone, but its screen displays not the user's applications, but the screens of everyone around them. This impossible device represents how surveillance and control have evolved in your contemporary world while remaining fundamentally unchanged in their essential nature. The same principles I observed in Renaissance Italy now operate through technologies I could never have imagined, but the human psychology they exploit remains identical in your corporate environments. I see the same dynamics that governed medieval courts. Managers build alliances, gather intelligence about competitors, and position themselves for advancement through careful manipulation of information and relationships. The modern office hierarchy may appear more egalitarian than aristocratic courts, but the fundamental competition for resources, status, and influence operates according to the same principles I documented centuries ago. Your social media platforms have become the ultimate tools for reputation management and strategic deception. Leaders can now craft their public images with unprecedented precision, controlling not just what people see, but when they see it, and in what context. The ability to appear virtuous while pursuing self-interest has been amplified enormously by technologies that allow constant performance of preferred identities. I observe how your democratic political systems have perfected the art of appearing responsive to public will while actually serving elite interests. Politicians conduct polls and focus groups not to discover what people want, but to learn how to present predetermined policies in ways that generate popular support. The appearance of democratic accountability provides legitimacy for decisions that often benefit the politically connected rather than the general population. Your economic systems demonstrate how financial manipulation can achieve what military force accomplished in my era. Economic dependencies created through debt, trade, relationships, and resource control can compel behavior more effectively than armies. Nations and individuals who seem free find themselves constrained by financial obligations that limit their choices as completely as any physical prison. The digital panopticon reveals how modern surveillance creates new possibilities for social control. Your communications, purchases, movements, and associations are monitored constantly, creating detailed profiles that predict and influence your behavior. This information asymmetry gives those who control the surveillance systems enormous advantages over those being monitored. Even in supposedly free societies, I see how your educational and media institutions shape public consciousness through controlling access to information and framing interpretations of events. The same techniques that Renaissance princes used to manage popular opinion now operate through schools, universities, news organizations, and entertainment companies. The illusion of free inquiry and open debate masks systematic efforts to promote certain viewpoints while marginalizing others, your technological corporations have achieved what no monarch ever could: intimate access to the private thoughts and desires of billions of people. Through search histories, social media interactions, and purchasing patterns, they understand individual psychology better than people understand themselves. This knowledge becomes power when translated into targeted advertising, political messaging, and behavioral modification. The principles of alliance and betrayal that I observed among Italian city-states now play out among multinational corporations and international organizations. Treaties become trade agreements, military alliances become economic partnerships, and territorial expansion becomes market penetration. The scale has changed dramatically, but the fundamental dynamics remain identical. I notice how your professional environments reward the same combinations of apparent virtue and practical ruthlessness that I documented in political leaders. Successful executives project images of ethical leadership and social responsibility, while making decisions based primarily on competitive advantage and profit maximization. The ability to reconcile public morality with private pragmatism remains essential for advancement. Your democratic institutions demonstrate how the appearance of popular control can coexist with elite domination. Voters choose between options that have been pre-selected by those with access to campaign funding, media influence, and institutional support. The formal mechanisms of democracy provide legitimacy while ensuring that fundamental power relationships remain unchanged. The digital panopticon reminds me that human nature has not evolved despite technological advancement. People still seek status, security, and control over their environments. They still respond to fear and incentives in predictable ways. They still prefer comfortable illusions to difficult truths. Understanding these constants allows you to navigate modern power structures using principles that have proven effective across centuries of human experience. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Those who understand the rules of power and influence will continue to shape outcomes, while those who remain naive about these dynamics will continue to be shaped by them. The choice between controlling your circumstances and being controlled by others remains as relevant today as it was 500 years ago. The shield of awareness that hangs upon my wall appears transparent at first glance, but reveals the true nature of incoming attacks while protecting the bearer from harm. This crystalline defense represents how understanding power dynamics provides your most reliable protection against those who would manipulate and control you. Knowledge itself becomes armor when you learn to recognize the techniques others use to influence your decisions and shape your behavior. First, you must develop the ability to identify manipulation in real time. When someone appeals to your emotions while discouraging rational analysis, they are likely trying to override your judgment. When they create artificial urgency or scarcity, they want to prevent you from seeking alternatives or gathering additional information. When they offer you something that seems too good to be true, they probably intend to extract something more valuable in return. Learn to recognize the patterns of strategic deception I have described. When people volunteer information that makes them appear vulnerable or disadvantaged, question whether this revelation serves their actual interests. When they seem to offer you exactly what you want without apparent benefit to themselves, consider what they might gain that is not immediately obvious. When they present you with choices that all serve their purposes while appearing to give you control, look for options they have not mentioned. Building your own power base provides essential protection against those who would dominate you. This does not require becoming manipulative yourself, but it does require developing capabilities that others respect and want to access. Cultivate skills that remain valuable across different circumstances. Build relationships with people who can provide support during difficult periods. Maintain resources that give you alternatives when others try to limit your choices. Understand the economics of any relationship or situation where someone claims to be helping you. What do they gain from your success? What would they lose from your independence? How do their incentives align with or conflict with your long-term interests? When someone's assistance makes you more dependent on them rather than more capable of independent action, be particularly cautious about their true motivations. The transparent shield teaches us that protection often requires maintaining multiple perspectives simultaneously. You must be able to participate in social and professional relationships while remaining analytically detached from the emotional manipulation these relationships might involve. This dual consciousness allows you to respond appropriately to others' expectations while protecting your core interests. Develop information independence by cultivating multiple sources for important decisions. When someone controls your access to information about a situation, they can manipulate your choices by controlling what you know. Seek out alternative perspectives, especially from those whose interests differ from the people directly involved in influencing your decision. Cross-reference claims against independently verifiable facts whenever possible. Learn to distinguish between influence that serves mutual benefit and influence that serves only the other party's interests. Legitimate persuasion typically involves honest presentation of trade-offs and respect for your right to make different choices. Manipulation typically involves hidden agendas, emotional pressure, and attempts to make alternatives appear impossible or unacceptable. Create boundaries around your decision-making process that prevent others from pressuring you into immediate commitments. Most manipulation techniques depend on preventing you from thinking carefully about your options or consulting with advisors who might offer different perspectives. Insist on time to consider important decisions, regardless of claims about limited availability or urgent deadlines. The shield reminds me that protection requires ongoing vigilance rather than one-time preparation. Those who would control you will adapt their techniques as you become more sophisticated about recognizing them. You must continue developing your awareness and defensive capabilities rather than assuming that initial knowledge provides permanent protection. However, protection should not become paranoia that prevents beneficial relationships and opportunities. The goal is developing judgment that distinguishes between legitimate influence and manipulative control, not avoiding all situations where others might affect your decisions. Understanding power dynamics should enhance your ability to participate effectively in society, not isolate you from human connection. Perhaps most importantly, remember that your best defense against being controlled is developing your own clarity about your values, objectives, and boundaries. When you know what you actually want and why you want it, manipulation attempts become much easier to recognize and resist. Those who would control you depend on your confusion about your own interests. Clarity about your authentic priorities provides the strongest possible protection. The transparent shield serves its purpose not by making you invulnerable, but by helping you see clearly what you face. With accurate perception, you can make informed choices about when to trust, when to be cautious, and when to remove yourself from situations that threaten your autonomy. This awareness transforms you from a passive target into an active participant who understands the game being played. The eternal flame that burns without consuming its fuel sits as the final artifact in my study, representing how the struggle for power and freedom continues across all generations, requiring constant vigilance from those who would remain free. This impossible fire burns steadily through centuries, neither growing nor diminishing, reminding me that the dynamics I have described are not temporary problems to be solved, but permanent aspects of human nature that must be understood and managed. As I reflect upon my life's work and observations, I am struck by how little has fundamentally changed despite the dramatic transformations in technology, society, and governance that have occurred since my time. human beings still seek security, status, and control over their circumstances. They still respond to incentives and fears in predictable ways. They still prefer comfortable illusions to difficult truths about how power actually operates. The flame represents continuity across apparent change. The specific methods of control and resistance evolve constantly, but the underlying patterns remain remarkably consistent. What I learned about the relationship between rulers and subjects applies equally to modern relationships between managers and employees, politicians and voters, institutions and individuals. The scales have changed, but the fundamental dynamics persist. This continuity means that the knowledge I have shared with you will remain relevant regardless of future technological or social developments. Understanding human psychology, recognizing manipulation techniques, and building personal autonomy will protect you whether you face medieval princes or modern corporations. The principles are timeless because they address permanent aspects of human nature, rather than temporary historical circumstances. However, this same continuity also means that the problems I have identified cannot be permanently solved through any system of government, technology, or social organization. Every generation must learn these lessons anew, because every generation includes those who will seek to control others and those who will resist being controlled. The dance continues because the music never stops. The eternal flame reminds me that my purpose in sharing this knowledge is not to make you cynical about human nature, but to make you realistic about human limitations. People are capable of genuine virtue, authentic love, and self-sacrifice for noble causes, but they are also capable of manipulation, betrayal, and exploitation when circumstances reward such behavior. Understanding both potentials allows you to respond appropriately to different situations. Your responsibility now is to carry this awareness forward without allowing it to corrupt your capacity for trust, love, and cooperation when such responses are warranted. The goal is not to become a manipulator yourself, but to develop immunity to manipulation by others. You can maintain your integrity while protecting yourself from those who would exploit your good nature. The flame that burns without consumption also represents hope that knowledge can be preserved and transmitted across generations without being diminished by the process. Each person who understands these principles can teach others, creating networks of awareness that make manipulation more difficult and resistance more effective. This is how progress occurs, not through eliminating human nature, but through spreading understanding of how it operates. I leave you with this final observation. The greatest victory against those who would control you is living a life guided by your own authentic values and genuine interests. When you know who you are and what you actually want, manipulation attempts lose their power because they cannot redirect you toward goals that do not serve you. Clarity about your own nature provides the strongest foundation for freedom. The eternal flame will continue burning long after my words are forgotten, because the struggle between control and freedom is woven into the fabric of human existence. Each generation must choose whether to seek domination over others or protection of their own autonomy. Each individual must decide whether to be a predator, prey, or someone who understands the game well enough to play it successfully while maintaining their essential humanity. Your awareness of these dynamics places a responsibility upon you to use this knowledge wisely and ethically. You now understand what most people never learn about how power operates in human society. This understanding can protect you and those you care about, but it can also tempt you to exploit others who remain naive. The choice you make will determine whether my teachings serve the cause of freedom or become tools for new forms of oppression. The flame burns eternal because the dance never ends, it only changes partners. Ensure that when your time comes to pass this knowledge forward, You do so in service of human dignity rather than human domination.